Welcome. I'm Dan Powers, Executive Director of the Society for Science at User Research Facilities, and I'm happy for you to be joining us at another session for our 2022 annual meeting. This session, we're going to be hearing from Meyer Seligman regarding what's going on in Congress and the protocols, the options, the outlook for federal government funding and other related protocols that would affect federal agencies and research entities that are funded by the federal government and congressional decisions. Before Mara comes on the screen, let me provide a little bit of background there. And her perspective and my conversations with her have really brought to light the inside baseball and some great detailed kind of nuance to what's happening and what laboratory leaders, interested scientists, and government affairs, government relations staff from federal agencies would find of most interest. Meyer leads currently now the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's Government Relations Office and was previously on staff before that, though, for 7 years with the U.S. Senate Committee on Appropriations, Energy and Water Subcommittee. She was responsible there for congressional oversight and providing funding for a variety of Department of Energy programs, including the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy and the Office of Science, two entities that are greatly part of the SSURF network and have influence over the activities that are happening within user facilities. Again, I mentioned that Meyer's insights was something that was quite profound. I found very helpful when I had conversations with her over the last few months. And as many of you probably are keenly aware of, the government is set to shut down if not approved for further funding as of a week from tomorrow. And we're hoping that things can come together with some rapid decisions to keep the government funded in a way that is as efficient as possible, and of course could lean into the type of authorizations and the aspirations that we have for funding scientific research in our country. So let me bring Meyer to the screen here, and we're going to have a good conversation, not a presentation as much as a back and forth as I prompt her to give us some of the latest details and some good insight on what's going on. So, Meyer, welcome to the SSURF annual meeting and this session describing appropriations outlook and other funding protocols that are happening in Congress as we speak. But let me turn this to you for a moment. I only gave a brief background of your biography. What else should the audience know as to what brought you to NREL, what you've been doing there in DC?
Well, thank you, Dan, for inviting me to provide this update and have this discussion with you on what we should expect for the next 25 days. I'm Meyer Seligman, Director of Government Relations at NREL. I joined NREL a little over a year ago to start their Office of Government Relations. I had spent about 16 years, a little over 16 years on Capitol Hill, both on the House and Senate side. Most recently, as Dan mentioned, working with many of you and your organizations during my time as a professional staff member on the Energy and Water Development Subcommittee on Appropriations in the United States Senate as majority staff. And I previously handled the funding and oversight activities for the Office of Science and EERE, Fossil Energy, Office of Electricity, CSER, the non-defense side of the ledger for the Department of Energy. But it also worked in some House offices as a legislative director, legislative assistant, staff assistant, scheduler, numerous capacities. So I'm still based in Washington, D.C. and still working with many of you in just different capacities while I'm here at NREL. But it is a wild week in DC, as Dan alluded to, and happy to just to answer questions and have a bit of a discussion on the next 25 days, because the next Congress does not convene until noon on January 3rd, which is mandated by the Constitution for odd-numbered years, unless Congress, of course, decides to pass a law allowing for Congress to convene on a different day. So that's the deadline The big deadline we're looking at, but the immediate deadline, as Dan alluded to, is the current continuing resolution funds the federal government through December 16th, which is next Friday. The expectation is that Congress will need to pass another short-term continuing resolution, so these conversations and negotiations on top lines can continue. But technically, the deadline by which everyone is looking at is the 3rd of January. So not that Congress wants to stick around for the remainder of the holiday season and through January, but that's what we're up against at this moment in time. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Mara. Let me ask you, almost stepping back a bit broadly. I know with different federal agencies, of course, many of the user facilities that are part of SSURF are under the Department of Energy umbrella, but there's National Science Foundation funded entities and other federal agencies, particularly the Department of Commerce, that could be affected by a government shutdown. When we hear that, can you describe a bit more of what might that mean, or are there different ways that a shutdown, and that somewhat daunting word, how does that actually affect the given agencies that you know are involved in federal research?
Well, for the Department of Commerce and for NSF specifically, they're funded under the Commerce Justice Science Subcommittee on Appropriations, which I worked very closely with my counterparts on that subcommittee previously. One thing I do want to flag is I am not currently concerned about a shutdown in any way, shape, or form starting next Friday. I just want to preface that with any other comments that I make. I'm not necessarily concerned. There's a lot of posturing for how Congress actually gets a deal on these top lines on the non-defense and defense side of the funding ledger that are going to occur, negotiations and posturing that are currently occurring and will continue to occur over the next week. But as we have seen over previous years, when some parts of the federal government are funded, others aren't, you are relying on reserves from your program of stewardship to continue you moving through that period of time under a shutdown. But at this moment in time, I'm not concerned about a shutdown occurring next week. So
okay. All right. Thank you for that context.
Yeah, a lot of momentum is building in order to move these bills forward and to finalize FY23 for the remainder of the fiscal year through October 1.
All right.
So.
Well, maybe then
I know the shutdown
like
conversation gets people a little anxious, but at this, OMB is obviously working through the processes by which they have to operate and providing anomalies for both funding and policy needs. If there were to be a year-long continuing resolution, they're providing those things to Capitol Hill. The agencies are providing those things to OMB. So those are some of the activities that are going on. Those recommendations and requests do go to the Committee on Appropriations for their consideration if they are going to have to be dealing with a long-term CR for the remainder of the fiscal year. But what we're seeing today is a lot of movement and posturing for negotiations to finalize 23 in an omnibus package.
Can you describe what does a continuing resolution end up doing, if that's the right word? How does that affect the budget that would come to given federal agencies?
So if it were a clean continuing resolution, what we refer to as a clean continuing resolution, that would just fund all of the existing programs at the levels by which they were funded, with the direction by which they were provided in the explanatory statements from last year's omnibus for the remainder of the fiscal year. The agencies would have to follow that direction. If there are also continuing resolutions that have been passed over the past 20 years that updated top line spending levels for programs. They did at least change the funding levels for different programs. So there's different iterations of continuing resolutions that can be considered, but a clean one, what we would expect, because continuing resolutions are not written to make people comfortable. You don't want a continuing resolution. You want Congress to actually pass bills on time And in advance of October 1, a continuing resolution is meant to squeeze and make uncomfortable some of the programs for their operations in order to get a final bill for that fiscal year finalized. So,
okay. So
continuing resolutions are no way to operate the federal government or fund the government. So they're not intended to make people very comfortable.
yes, that's the talk or the option of doing one for an entire year. That does seem daunting. It may not be actually a shutdown, but that kind of a version of freezing a budget for that long would definitely have certain types of negative impacts, as certain programs rely on like a new phase of funding that would not be included in a
your construction money, whether it's TPC or OPC funding that needs to be updated from year to year for different user facilities, or if it's science laboratory infrastructure investments and construction of facilities that are necessary, GPP projects. But I think that I am going to remain optimistic as a typically pessimistic individual who has probably been jaded from working on Capitol Hill for a very long time. This is, I think we're kind of seeing a perfect environment for deals to be cut and deals to be reached over the next week or so.
Okay.
So, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about this, but the 16th, obviously next Friday, the CR runs out at midnight. Discussions have suggested an extension through the following Friday, the 23rd, if not later in the month. And what we're seeing is potentially, if there's no top line deal by the beginning of next week, Senate Democrats plan to post and offer their own version of an omnibus spending package on Monday. That is essentially a conferenced package. It's what we would call a two-corner deal, the two corners being the Senate majority and the House majority, that have agreed to a bill for each of the subcommittees. So they would post this omnibus package on Monday. If Republicans reject the offer, which they are expected to if this is posted, then the Democrats will offer a full year continuing resolution at current funding levels. Both bills won't be able to make the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. And so a short-term CR will be necessary to continue those negotiations. But given this dynamic environment we're operating in, I would just stay tuned. I think that agreement will be reached. We're seeing this is political posturing at its finest, and pressure being put on members to actually come together and agree to these funding levels. The defense funding levels, as many of you have seen, and the House is going to be voting on later this afternoon, the negotiated text of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2022 was filed and released earlier this week. The House is going to vote today. It's expected to pass by a term called the suspension of rules, which is a fast track consideration of legislation that limits debate in the House of Representatives and requires the support of 2/3 of the House of Representatives for passage. It's typically reserved for non-controversial items. The NDAA is going to go on suspension this afternoon. What that does is the difference between authorizing and appropriations language. The NDAA sets a bipartisan, bicameral defense authorization funding level for FY23, which should clear the way for defense funding levels to be agreed upon in the FY23 Appropriations Omnibus Act. So the defense side of the ledger is essentially agreed to from a bipartisan, bicameral standpoint. It's the non-defense side of the funding, discretionary funding, that is still up for discussion. One of the big ticket items has nothing to do with science and research facilities. That is holding up a lot of these discussions. In previous years, there's been a push to classify some veterans' healthcare funding as mandatory spending versus its current classification of discretionary spending. And so that has been discretionary spending is what the appropriations process is. It is subject to the yearly bills. It's mandatory spending is direct spending that's controlled by other laws. For example, entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, student loans, deposit insurance, retirement programs for federal employees, those are all considered mandatory spending. And mandatory spending takes up about 2/3 of the federal budget. The discretionary side of the ledger, the appropriations process, is about 1/3 of the overall federal budget. And so if VA healthcare funding were to be shifted from the discretionary side of the ledger over to the mandatory side of the ledger, there would be some headroom and some relief from the current funding pressures required for that VA healthcare spending on the defense, on the discretionary side of the ledger. This has been going on, this debate, whether to classify this program, the VA Choice Act, as mandatory or discretionary since 2018, since it was initially passed. But there's disagreement as to how to characterize that. Republicans don't want more for non-defense than what the president's budget has requested. They see the fact that IRA and IIJA have been passed over the past 2 years and have provided supplemental funding for non-defense programs as a reason not to increase the non-defense side of the ledger. So that's kind of a brief overview as current state of play.
Context as to some forces that are shaping the decision making. Let me ask then a bit more specifically back into some of the research realm of funding, since we don't have the fiscal year 23 budget yet approved. Many, well, not just the scientists and the lab leadership, but even the general public has been waiting to see, or even might have a misinformed sense that the funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act will be, say, flowing into the federal agencies, and that distinction between authorization and actual appropriation is lost in many conversations. What is your sense of how what has been authorized will or could still come into an FY23 budget decision?
Well, I think that you see the marks that each of the 12 subcommittees have provided from the Appropriations Committee. You've seen those, and then in that time, IRA has been passed, the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 has been passed. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, and especially for the Department of Energy, it does not provide additional funding for the Department of Energy. It only authorizes funding. So it authorizes programs into existence, programs of record, with direction for how those programs should be set up. But it is contingent upon Congress actually providing appropriations, i.e. the actual funding to do those activities. And so you can authorize programs, but if there's no funding, that program does not exist. And that increased funding does not exist. So there are aspirational levels to fund towards. That is typically, and it is actually creating the program of record. And so the CHIPS and Science Act is really important because it highlights the levels at which all of these Department of Energy programs, NSF programs, Department of Commerce programs, where they should be funded, at what levels they should be funded. But based, in reality, when you're an appropriations staffer, when you're on the Appropriations Committee, you have a certain level of funding to work with because you're bound by a top line agreement that's been negotiated by leadership and by the chairs and ranking members of the Appropriations Committee for each 12 bills. And you have a certain amount of money and you have to determine how you're going to spend that money based on all of the member input from the bills that you've written, and what Congress and the administration have both requested through their respective processes. So a lot of times programs are authorized at levels at which there's not enough funding in reality to fund towards. And you also have to take into consideration a lot of new programs that are being authorized. you can't just take funding away from existing programs to pay for new programs because there's ongoing work within those existing programs. So, so there's a lot of new priorities that have been requested by the administration. There's a lot of increased funding requests for existing programs, and it's really just, you have to manage through writing these bills in a way that we like to say doesn't break any programs, doesn't break anything, and just managing through all of the requests that you have from both sides of Congress. So.
So in that way, the aspirations of the CHIPS and Science Act are still in the mix then of some of these debates, and of course with perhaps a continuing resolution bumping a final omnibus bill or even a given line item for the budget, that final decision. There's then also the context of the leadership change, majority change within the House of Representatives. How do you see that context affecting some of the budget decision-making timeline?
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting 2 years ahead of us. Just, a brief overview. So the Republican House majority will consist currently of 221 Republicans and 213 Democrats. 218 is the magic number to reach a majority. There's one remaining race that has not been called in the House of Representatives. That's incumbent Representative Lauren Boebert's recount. Colorado law mandates a recount in races where the margin is 0.5% or less, and Adam Frisch, her opponent, has conceded the race, is not directly contesting the results, has discouraged his supporters from contributing to a recount fund, but the recount has been ordered. So should be concluded by December 13th. She's leading by 550 votes. It would be a significant and unusual change in a House recount for that to change. But that should be decided by the 13th. So that's the House state of play. That's a very thin margin for the House majority, 221 or 222, for example, which would be the expected final House majority level. The Democratic Senate majority was just confirmed with the runoff on Tuesday between incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker of Georgia. Senator Warnock's win secures a 51-49 Democratic-led Senate for the next 2 years, which is a big difference between a 50-50 Senate, which is what we're currently operating in. Democrats have an actual majority with a 51 Senate on Senate committees starting in January. Committee membership is evenly split currently. This allows an actual majority on all committees for Senate Democrats moving forward, and is a massive advantage for the majority to work through nominations and legislation faster within the United States Senate. So that 2-seat majority in the Senate ensures votes on the Senate floor don't have to be determined by the vice president breaking a tie. I think the current statistic is that she's broken 26 ties so far in the current Senate, and that's the most by any vice president in modern times. So you see these two different dynamics, and the Biden administration for the remainder of the 2 years. Kevin McCarthy has come out very publicly about what his priorities are for the House of Representatives. Those differ greatly from the United States Senate, Senator Schumer's priorities. So it's going to be an interesting 2 years. I think that every single year, the Appropriations Committee write a bill in preparation for, is there something that goes wrong that leads us into a continuing resolution for another year? Let's write a bill that is most updated. And that's the point, right? You write an appropriations bill every single year to update to as current levels and current direction as you possibly can to prevent for future year changes in majorities and minorities. So it's not impossible to say that the House Republican majority won't negotiate with a Senate Democratic majority and a Democratic administration. It's just going to be a lot more difficult to get agreement upon, because their appropriations bills next year in FY24 are going to vary vastly from the Senate marks. And so when the House and the Senate come together to have a conversation about negotiations, both of those bills are going to be vastly different with vastly different priorities. So.
Okay, well, this is then a good segue. So FY24 is on the radar, actually a front burner issue for the SURF Board of Directors and for our conversations and efforts in Washington, D.C., really just starting after the new year. So with that picture that you just painted of these vastly different priorities coming out of either side of the Senate or the House, how do you see, or how might you recommend conversations be brought to those different houses by organizations like SURF and other science education, science advocacy organizations? What will resonate?
Well, I think and as we saw in the Trump administration and previous years, where budget proposals, for EERE, for science example, the last administration proposed to significantly decrease funding for certain programs across the Department of Energy, across the Department of Commerce. And having those conversations with your organization and making sure that their programs of record, their construction line items, their research funding needs through the programs that they rely on for funding, making sure that there is a clear understanding of impacts at different levels. I think internally working through, most of you guys have government relations directors or government relations organizations. Dan, you and I talk on a regular basis, and just making sure that there is a narrative and that there is a plan, a clear discussion and a clear ask before your organizations come to Congress, and that you've got information on impacts. Going into 24, we should have a 23 omnibus. Everyone can plan for at least the remainder of the 23 fiscal year 23. But working internally to best understand how you're going to be impacted by funding decreases or funding increases, and what your funding increases needs actually look like, and what they are for. But a lot of these programs of record, a lot of these construction projects, you go through the CD process within your respective agencies, and that there is a plan in place. And so those expectations are a lot of the time already known. And so just working through and making sure you're communicating to provide updates on those projects, and if there are any additional needs or changes in those projects and needs.
Now, let me ask then almost a bit more specifically, given your position now with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the relationship then with the Department of Energy's Office of Science. As you may have seen yesterday, we were fortunate to have a greeting and some 2023 outlook comments from Director Berhe. And I wonder what you see as being some particular highlights and aspirations for the Office of Science that ideally would be funded in at least the FY23, or maybe I should say at least the FY24 budget conversations. It'd be interesting for us at SURF to know, for the overall network to know some examples of what, in a good way, basically compels you and gets you excited about what is possible, what's to be built on that's already happening. Yeah.
Well, I think, across the S&T ecosystem, we have all seen a lot of support from Congress over the years. People are excited. This is an economic engine. It's an intellectual engine. It's a competitiveness engine, a national security engine. People are excited to invest in research, development, and deployment activities. And so even when budget requests for these programs for the Office of Science, for example, are less than what we would like for them to be, Congress takes that into account and understands, learns, about what's going on in OSCAR and BES and BER and NP and FES and all of the exciting things that are going on across the Office of Science. And they want to ensure that the United States leads in these areas. And so, so I think that when these organizations are meeting with congressional staff and members of Congress, this is a great news story to tell. This is always what I like to call a very happy bipartisan place to talk about, because people are invested in all of our organizations across the board, because this is where change occurs, and this is where science occurs, and this is necessary for the United States to move forward in terms of competitiveness. So it's a good news story. It's a happy place to talk about. It's supported on the bipartisan basis, a bicameral bipartisan basis. And so I feel good about the outlook as we've seen over the past 10 years. We've seen record level funding for the Office of Science, record level funding for EERE, for OE, for CSER, for increases to FECM. And then with the IIJA investments and the IRA investments, it's even more so. And we can't deploy these activities without the fundamental and applied research that currently exists and has been ongoing. We're only able to deploy these activities because of all of the investments that have been made up to this point. So this is a good news story. So,
all right. Let me prompt you then on a couple other contextual themes. I just wonder how you see them affecting in a good way, perhaps empowering the conversations for FY23 finally being approved and FY24 negotiations. What we have heard from members, and is a bit of the zeitgeist in the scientific community, on the energy side, it's a little bit more of a focus, is in essence, the nation, if not the world's energy paradigm evolution, and what that means in terms of the kinds of technology, and then very closely associated with that would be the sort of jobs that are there. And to put more of a point on it, the reduction or change in legacy fossil fuel energy sourcing to new renewable energy sourcing, and how that is shifting the regional economies and opportunities for companies down to individual workers. So that topic of energy paradigm shift is large and definitely influential in parts of the country, areas of Colorado where I live, and where there's that type of resource extraction that is still so crucial to our energy system. All right, before I go too far off on that tangent, the other realm, though, that also is in a great way becoming a more top of mind and intentional conversation, we have a panel discussion on this tomorrow, is the diversity, equity, inclusion, outreach to underserved communities, or engagement with previously lesser connected communities. That is happening with the energy realm, has a bit of a Venn diagram there, but across all of the scientific research entities, ensuring that there's just an involvement with people who frankly do not look like me as an older white man. And that seems to be another place where the discussions around budgeting find much more common ground. There's a bipartisan and a across economic strata kind of agreement that this is where we should be moving and investing federal research dollars. So thanks. That's not even a question as much as I'm commenting on those two themes. Tell me what you're seeing in those realms.
You know, I think there's always been a level of community engagement that goes on with research and development activities across numerous agencies. I don't think that we've put enough focus on that. I feel like there is a much larger focus currently on community engagement and workforce development opportunities, and how you're engaging in STEM, and how you are attracting the next iteration of talent and the next generation of talent, how you're working with community colleges and university partners to plan for the next generation of workers. But then what do those community engagement strategies look like? Because they're not a one-size-fits-all approach. Different regions have different challenges, different regions have different resources, different states have different goals, communities have goals. So how does the federal government better partner and better prepare these communities for engaging on decarbonization strategies or cost reduction strategies. How do you make more efficient, effective, cost-effective strategies for your community? And how do you invest in more resilient systems? I mean, I think that we have seen extreme weather instances all across the United States that are impacting communities at numerous levels. And so how are these investments best deployed, and how do you ensure that these federal agencies, the national laboratory systems, user facilities, do support those communities at the community level based on what their needs are? And so there seems to be a massive shift, really focusing on not a one-size-fits-all approach, but a tailored approach for each community's needs. So I think there's a lot of good news stories, and this is what, all politics, when you go back to Washington, all politics are local. And so how are you leveraging that federal investment in those communities and partnering with those communities to create a better scenario for those individuals that live in those communities, and that meets their goals, not someone else enforcing their goals upon them, but how do you help a community meet their goals? So
thank you.
All good news stories.
Thank you. That's helpful. That can be a theme within our messaging to our civic and political leaders on behalf of
there's so many federal agencies that are involved in this. There's independent regional economic development commissions. There's all of the R&D arms across the federal government. So this is an exciting time to see how different agencies partner together for the success.
All right. Was there anything I didn't ask you about that you think people should know? We just have a few minutes left here.
The only other thing we didn't talk about is nominations, which I do think are of interest for many in the political world. There have been many individuals that have been nominated for different political leadership positions across multiple agencies. What you are seeing right now is the United States Senate Committees of Jurisdiction considering nominees in hearings and voting to report them from the committee by the year end, by this January 3rd date, to ensure that, one, the president doesn't have to renominate these individuals. And there is always, at the end of every Congress, there is typically a nominations package that considers and moves forward nominations. And this is agreed upon from the majority and minority side. They work together to create this package that can move forward without controversy. So expect to see nominations move forward. For DOE, for instance, you've seen the Energy and Natural Resources Committee process and report out nominees for the Office of Electricity, Energy Efficiency, and Renewable Energy and Infrastructure. We're hoping that those individuals can get put into place in the new year after being considered by the full Senate. But the Commerce Committee is considering. The Foreign Affairs Committee is considering different nominees and just trying to make sure that these nominees clear before the end of the calendar year. Otherwise, the president has to renominate those individuals.
Right, and with that likely contentious dynamic between the House and Senate. This would actually just
the
be
House
Senate.
does not consider nominees. The House does not consider nominees, just the Senate. So
their own contentiousness.
There's a whole process by which you have to be considered, and paperwork and all of the things that go along with that. So
all right.
Yeah. So that's just the last other year-end item that people might be looking at, is getting people into place. So
well, thank you, Meyer, for this insight. We will continue our conversations for those who are watching this, and as we share this and prompt others to engage in the conversation. The theme that got started yesterday by our board chair, Lily Troya, regarding volunteer outreach for SSURF. We're always interested to hear from scientists, from lab leaders, from users who have a perspective on how SSURF could best engage, best tell their stories, the good news stories like Meyer was alluding to. And I put that out on the table again. Any of the audience members now, or people as you are watching this in the future on demand, please reach to SSURF and let us know if there's a particular story you think we should be highlighting, or just your ideas on how we can best be advocating on your behalf. Thanks for the conversation today, Meyer. Really appreciate
Thank you.
hearing your insight. This is really helpful.
Stay tuned.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll take a break. We'll be starting up again at 1 o'clock Eastern with a presentation by Dr. Richard Oram with the National Science Foundation.